All righty, shall we begin?
Sure.
All right, so I'd like to thank everybody for coming to tonight's program. We've been running, as you know, these programs all throughout April, and we now have a lineup for May since it looks like we're not going very far. Lisanne is today's presenter, and she is the historian with Friends of Anderson Park. She's presented for us on the Bellevue Theater, on Oakcroft, on the Bellevue Library. And her presentations, I'm always so impressed with her research and with the way she presents them. They're always fascinating. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisanne, let you take it, and you can start sharing your screen, Lisanne. And I want to thank you for coming tonight and for being willing to do it in this kind of weird and new world format.
All right, thank you. Anderson Park, which will reopen on Saturday morning, so get ready for nice weather and a chance to go to the park. Several things make Anderson Park significant. Probably one of the primary reasons it's on the National Register of Historic Places is because of its Olmstead design. It was designed by John Charles Olmstead. He was with the successor firm to Frederick Law Olmsted, and I'll tell you more about him later. This picture here is of Anderson Park around 1908. And another reason, and this is John Charles Olmsted at his drafting table, also around 1909. Also, Essex County had the first countywide park system in the nation. And this is part of the Essex County Park System. And it was created as part of an effort to sort of be part of the City Beautiful movement, which was going on around the turn of the century. And it was also a direct response to urban squalor that had been seen in New York City, and then concerns of it in Newark and later in Montclair. So it was this whole effort to beautify and to have a more healthy environment. And so in this picture, the one that says a bit of the parks, the lower right-hand corner picture is Anderson Park, and you can see the woman sitting there on the bench. And here is a picture, an atlas map from 1906 of Anderson Park. It had just opened the year before this map was created, and the little yellow squares show you where buildings are. And as you can see, to the south of the park, there was hardly any construction at all, and that is just about to change when the park opens. And this aerial shows you what I think is one of the important features of the park, and that is that it's a really nice buffer between this commercial area to the west. Well, actually, I guess it's to the east. I'm looking at this upside down. But it's a buffer between the commercial area and the residential area, and it sort of functions as a village green. I'm going to just sort of start out by saying that I see the park as spanning the Ice Age to the Space Age. And by that, I mean the park has these Ice Age boulders. There are 6 of these smooth boulders in the park, and they're technically called erratics, and they were brought to this area 20,000 years ago at the tail end of the Ice Age. And one of the things that distinguishes an erratic from just any other big rock is that they have a really smooth, almost sculptural surface. And that's because the glaciers drag them down here from where they had been originally. And that process of sort of being dragged for miles and miles with other chunks of rock and gravel is that functioned as a giant rock polisher and made these boulders really smooth. And there's 6 of these boulders in the park that are strategically placed near the pathways, and at the main entrance there's a triangular arrangement of them. So they were used by Olmsted in a rather artistic way. And by Olmsted, I mean John Charles Olmsted, but even before him, his stepfather, Frederick Law Olmsted, used these boulders to great advantage, particularly in Central Park, where they were strategically placed. And at the time that the first Olmsted was using these boulders, people didn't really understand the whole concept of the Ice Age. It was just starting to be understood. And the understanding before that was that these giant boulders had been brought here and left during Noah's flood. So scientists were just figuring out what was happening, where these things really came from when the first Olmsted was designing, and he was fascinated with them. He made bridges out of them and did all sorts of things with them. And you can see here, they really, even in the winter, stand out very nicely. People love to climb on them and play on them. They make really good focal points. And then in terms of the space age, Buzz Aldrin here, the Apollo astronaut, grew up in a house just at the south end of the park. And he used to play football in the park, and he told us that he used the boulders as goalposts and other markings for football. This is the south end of the park. This is from the Buzz Aldrin house. You can see the Buzz Aldrin plaque there. And that's the Buzz Aldrin house. Here, this is what the park looked like really right before it was being developed. I mean, this picture was probably taken when they knew that there was going to be a park, but before it had actually been developed. So in the very, very early days, this property, before it was what we know as Montclair, as probably a lot of you know, it was Speartown, which was the Dutch settlement that was what we now know as Upper Montclair. And, you know, in the early days, this was very rural land, agricultural, just kind of a commercial and agricultural crossroads, and not really much need for parks at all. But then the train station came along, and in Upper Montclair, that was in the very early 1870s. And the train station, this is the Upper Montclair station that you see here, that changed everything. It spurred a lot of growth and led to the development of Montclair, particularly Upper Montclair being a fashionable railroad suburb. And one reason that the park is sited where it is, that, you know, the particular property that we now know as the park was chosen, was because of the train station. When Charles Anderson offered to donate the property in 1902, the Montclair Times had this to say. They said, "If there is any one spot above all which should be kept well and beautiful, it is the land about the railroad station, where the stranger receives his first impression of a place, for better or worse. The approaches to our several railroad stations are not particularly inviting, and Mr. Anderson's example may lead others to nod in this direction." So town leaders were very interested in making a good first impression. There were often many real estate agents right across the street from the train station. So that was important. And it was sort of a marketing effort to boost the image of Montclair. Now, this is Charles Anderson and his wife, Annie. And this dirt road that they're on in 1887 is either North Mountain Avenue, which had a different name back then, or Watchung Avenue. The family has two identical photos with two different labels on them. But so it's one of those two major streets at the time. And so Charles Anderson and Annie moved to Montclair with their very young family in 1871. And this is Charles Anderson around the time that the park opened. He was the first general insurance agent in New York City. And he was sort of a classic 19th century up by the bootstraps kind of character. He was born in Philadelphia. His family moved to Brooklyn when he was about 2. And he was one of 9 children. His father, who had been a carpenter and a shipbuilder and a mechanic, died when Charles was about 6. So Charles's formal education ended when he was around 11 years old. And his first job when he was 10 was hauling material for umbrellas around New York City. He later delivered newspapers and groceries, and he picked raspberries. By the age of 11, he was working as a printer's devil, which is kind of like a gopher in a printing shop. And he nearly lost his hand in a printing press. And by the time he was 18, he got a job as a clerk at the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. And then by 1872, he was working for something called the State Mutual Life Insurance Company. He stayed there for more than half a century and became very well compensated. And he wrote life insurance policies for a lot of prominent men, including 3 presidents of Standard Oil. And as I said, he became very successful, and he and his wife Annie wound up contributing thousands of dollars to charities and churches around Montclair. This is Annie, and I always like to point her out because, you know, Charles Anderson himself gets all the credit in all the contemporaneous newspaper articles and whatnot. But Annie herself, she was on the deed when the property was donated to become a park, and she herself, even after her husband's death, was very charitable, gave a lot of money to the Christian Science Church in Montclair, and she was, you know, a formidable figure in and of herself. This picture taken in the park probably around 1914. The woman on the left is Charles and Annie Anderson's daughter and her 2 children. The little girl with the bow in her hair grew up to be Betty Evans, who was the first female Montclair commissioner. And she was, she's the sister of this little boy on the right, who he unfortunately wound up being a name on the Edgemont War Memorial. Now, the Anderson family in the late teens and early 1920s were very instrumental in shaping the development of Upper Montclair's business district, both Charles Anderson and his son Robert. Among the buildings that they built that really shaped the Upper Montclair district is this building right here to the left of the photo, which was called originally Anderson Apartments. It was the first apartment building in Upper Montclair, and on the ground floor was the Fox Dry Goods store. And then in the 1930s, this building was redesigned to how we know it today as a bank. So it has now a limestone facade on the ground floor. And then they also built this building, which was originally the post office. It was built in 1918. It's now on the National Register. And then this building, of course, we all know, and if you're like me, you're hoping it has a good future. The Bellevue Theater was built in 1922 by the Anderson family. And this building and the post office both really helped solidify the Tudor style, sort of English village feeling of the Upper Montclair business district. Now, to talk about the park's development itself, this is a photo taken by John Charles Olmsted in 1902 of the future park site. So this is the park land, and there were 3 houses on the park property, as well as a firehouse. So stepping back for a minute, I just want to give you a little bit of history of the Essex County Park Commission, because Anderson Park was one of the first, not the first, but one of the early parks to come into that system of parks. It's also one of the smallest. So in 1896, Essex County was establishing its trailblazing park system. And I say trailblazing because, as I mentioned earlier, it was the first countywide park system in the nation. And the significance of that is that you have a lot more latitude in your planning of a park. You can say, you know, let's say you have this really great piece of property that would make a terrific park, but maybe part of it is in one town and part of it is in another town. And so maybe you just, if you're just going to have a city park, you would only use the part of the land that's in your city. But if you can sort of think more broadly and have pieces of property that span more than one municipality, as we do with some of the reservations and also Brookdale Park, that gives you, you can think more out of the box, you can think more broadly. And so that was really significant. And at the same time that Essex County was developing its park system, a group of people in Montclair, including Charles Anderson, were also talking about just creating what would ultimately become Anderson Park. And their original concept was much more grand. It was about 100 acres, and it would have stretched from Bellevue Avenue to the north all the way to Watchung Avenue to the south, bordered by what is now North Mountain Avenue to the west and Valley Road to the east. So that was their original concept. And they were hoping, Charles Anderson and other people were hoping that a lot of landowners would donate their land, but that was not to happen. So ultimately it was only Charles Anderson who donated his land, which was about a little over 14 acres. And that property at the time was considered swampy and unsightly and a nuisance, quote, nuisance to the health and beauty of the town. And there were in what is now the southeastern section of the park, it was extremely marshy, and there were cattails growing, and there was a concern about mosquito breeding grounds and so forth. So the property probably had some marginal agricultural use. We know that Charles Anderson tried to grow some vegetables on it, not terribly successfully, and there was at some time hay growing on here. But other than that, I don't know. There's nothing recorded about any sort of more significant use of this property. Let me go back a minute. These houses, which we're looking at the backs of these houses that were on this property, and they were moved when the park was under construction, and two of them stand here on North Mountain Avenue, just a half a block to the south of the park these days. Their numbers 293 and 295 North Mountain Avenue. And what happened to the third house remains a mystery. The other piece of real estate that was on the park site before it became a park was the Cliffside Hose No. 4 fire station, which you see here with the park in the background. So this fire station was pretty much at the very northeast corner of the park on Bellevue Avenue, right near the railroad tracks. And this fire station, around 1903, 1904, when the park was being built, was put on skids and pulled east down Bellevue Avenue to become a clubhouse for a golf course that used to be on the northeast corner of Bellevue Avenue and Grove Street. Now, although there was enthusiasm for the park before it was actually built, there was still some sluggishness on the part of Essex County to accept the donation. And you might say, well, why would someone not accept a free piece of land? And the reason is it costs money to develop a park. And thousands of dollars go into developing a park. And you also, there's probably some politics that go into selecting the site. So Essex County was not totally jumping on the bandwagon. And Charles Anderson was a little frustrated. So this plan for a subdivision appeared. What you're looking at here is the Anderson Park property carved up into 62 housing spots that he essentially claimed he was going to build. And one of the interesting things about this subdivision plan is who it's made by. It's made by someone named Downing Vaux, who became a prominent landscape architect, but he also happened to be the son of the co-designer of Central Park in New York. So Central Park was designed by Downing Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. So Downing Vaux and John Charles Olmsted were childhood friends. They grew up as their fathers were building Central Park. So they knew each other. And Downing Vaux also lived in Montclair for a while. And my theory, and this is just a theory, it's an educated guess, I don't have any smoking gun to support this, but I think that probably John Charles Olmsted went to Downing Vaux and Charles Anderson and said, let's just kind of come up with a bluff here and say we're going to build this subdivision, and then to put pressure on Essex County to say yes to our park plan. And it probably did the job, because within a matter of weeks after this was shown around, Essex County Parks Commission did vote to accept the park site into the Essex County Park System. And their only stipulation was that the county, that voters in Montclair had to adopt a $1 million countywide appropriation for park maintenance, and they did, of course, do that. So now we have more than a century. Well, actually, this year is 125 years since the Essex County Park System was created, and there's 30 parks, actually 32 park properties now in that system. And number 15 is Anderson Park, so that's kind of up here to the north. As you can see, it's one of the smaller parks in the system, but it is one of the older ones as well. And I show you this because it's a booklet from a realtor. This is from 1913, and it's promoting one of the things it promotes. It's promoting Montclair in general, but if you flip through the pages, one of the things that it's promoting is the parks in Montclair. So parks definitely were something that were desirable and helped sell real estate in town. This is John Charles Olmsted. You saw him earlier at the drafting table. He was the primary designer of Anderson Park. He was managed to be both the nephew and later the stepson of Frederick Law Olmsted. And he, with his brother Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., joined the partnership in the firm in 1884. And he had many assignments around the nation. You know, places like Anderson Park were probably among his smaller jobs, but probably one of his most prominent jobs was designing the U.S. Capitol grounds. Then in 1898, when Frederick Law Olmsted was failing in health and had dementia issues, John Charles Olmsted and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. created the Olmsted Brothers firm, and which was the successor firm, and that is the technical name of the firm that did Anderson Park and most of the parks in Essex County system. So John Charles Olmsted became a founding member and a president of the American Society of Landscape. He was the first president of the American Society of Landscape Architects. So he was very prominent in the field. He visited Anderson Park for the very first time in August 1902 to scope it out and see what kind of recommendation he should make to the Essex County Park System. And he took pictures during that visit. We'll see some of them tonight. And he reported back that same day to the Essex County Park Commission that he thought the site would make one of the best neighborhood parks in the county's entire system. Privately, in this is what you're looking at here, is a letter that he wrote to his wife later that week. Privately, he thought that part of what might be going on was that there was an effort to, by building a park, to increasing the land values of properties around the park. And although that may sound a little bit nefarious, that was actually one of the stated goals of the Essex County Park System, was to improve property values around the park, because that then would enhance their property tax revenues. So, and that obviously did happen, as we'll see later. This is one of the pictures taken not on that first visit, but later when the park is under construction. I think this is from 1904. Here's the north end of the park as it's being built. And what's notable about this picture is you can see the kind of curved pathways being cut through the dirt there. And these kind of curvilinear pathways were a hallmark of Olmstedian design. And some of the other hallmarks of Olmsted design, which you see in Anderson Park, are the broad meadow, which is also doubles as an athletic field. There's a sort of a naturalistic pastoral quality. There's also landscape buffering, which by that I mean things like and these don't exist anymore, but in the park's original design, all along the railroad tracks, poplar trees were planted to be a buffer between the railroad tracks and the park. Those have died off by now, but things like that, and now Friends of Anderson Park, for example, is trying to recreate some of the buffering between cars and traffic, like on Bellevue Avenue and North Mountain Avenue, by replanting shrubbery, which has died out over the years. So this is the same spot that you just saw under construction roughly 2 years later. So here it's much more obvious, the curvilinear pathways. And these pathways are pretty much still the same as they were, the same now 115 years ago as they were when the park was brand new. This is another picture of the park during construction. This was taken in 1904. What I like about this picture is there's kind of two kinds of technology you can see. On the left-hand side, there is an electric car, and that's probably the car that Olmsted used to get to the park site, because in one of his letters, he talks about coming to the train station and in Newark, and then getting a ride in an electric car to the park site. And then on the far right, they're kind of hard to see. They're either horses or mules, but horses and mules were used to do a lot of the work in the park. And the horses and mules were rented from this place just on the opposite side of the railroad tracks from the park, called Osborne on Marcellus. It was a coal and lumber yard that was just immediately south of where the Bellevue Theater is now. And they rented out mules, horses, all sorts of construction materials, and they were conveniently located right across the street from the park, or the park in progress, I should say. I also want to point out some unrealized features that the park, sort of alternative universes of the park, if you will. This is a 1903 map for the park, and there's some things on here that never quite happened. You can see, obviously, there's a southward dip in the park that doesn't exist anymore. It never happened. And the reason it never happened is because there were some property owners there that did not want to give up their land, you know, to become part of the park. They were just a little bit beyond the property that Charles Anderson owned. So that extension never happened. Also on that south end of the park, there's what was called a subway, which was really would have been an underground pathway going from the south end of the park roughly to where Wildwood is now. And the idea of that would have been if you lived in the neighborhood that was just south of the park, even today, you have to walk all the way to the north end of the park to Bellevue Avenue if you want to go to Upper Montclair, or, you know, much further south and approach it from, you know, Brookfield Road. But this idea was, it was just a shortcut basically to get to the Upper Montclair Business District. We don't know why that didn't happen. And then you also see this smaller loop in the park, which was going to be a skating area. And it was, even though it was smaller because of the park didn't dip that far south, there was a little skating area there where the city would flood it in the winter to become a skating property. But that only lasted a few years, and once Edgemont Park opened, there was really no need for it anymore, and skating shifted to Edgemont Park. Just going to show you a few photos of the park in its very early days. This is a picture taken probably from the railroad tracks looking toward the mountain at the very south end of the park. And you can see how these tiny little shrubs that have just been planted all along the pathways, and they will grow into more densely fleshed out shrubbery along the pathways in a few years, as you see in this photo. This photo is looking northward toward the train station. Here's another one just showing some of the more denser vegetation. A lot of this is gone now, and part of what Friends of Anderson Park is doing is trying to recreate it as much as we can. And this is Bellevue Avenue. The park would be to your left, it's looking toward the mountain. So you can see there was much more like a line of trees along Bellevue Avenue at that time. This is from, I think, 1909 thereabouts. And also there were more trees along both other sides of the park around the same time. This is one of my favorite pictures of the park. This is from a postcard probably taken around 1907. And I just like it because you can see all these people, you can see how populated it is by people. And also there's a tree in the center of the picture, which is the tree that we now know as the giant white oak tree, which we call the Olmsted Oak. We call it that because it shows up in some pictures that Olmsted took that very first day he came to the park. So here it is as kind of a young adult or a teenager, if you will. This is just another picture that shows the lush, as you see in the background there, the lush shrubbery. And I show you this one because this has a lamppost in it. The lamps were not, street lights were not added until 1922 to the park. And this is just another picture looking probably northeast. And I like this picture too because there's a baby carriage in there. This picture here is from 1915. And one of the arguments made for establishing a town-wide park system was to give poor mothers that maybe lived in crowded apartment buildings without their own yards, to give them a place to take their babies out for fresh air. So somebody is taking their baby out for fresh air in this picture. And nice little heavy snow, and you get a good view of what the lampposts look like. This is pictures from 1935. Want to point out some of the special features in the park. Really the only example of a piece of artwork in Anderson Park is this plaque that's at the northeast entrance. The plaque was installed in November 1928, which was the year that Charles Anderson died. And it was put there to commemorate him for donating the land for the park. And at the dedication ceremony, the mayor at the time spoke and called Charles Anderson, quote, one of the most valuable citizens the town has ever had. There's an interesting background, whoops, to this. Hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Bear with me. Okay, so an interesting background to this. The plaque was made by the same foundry that made the doors for the U.S. Supreme Court building. And the tablet itself which has these trees on either side that sort of come together in the middle, was designed by Maxfield Keck, and he was the brother of Charles Keck, who designed the statue in Edgemont Park. Maxfield Keck lived in Montclair. Maxfield is the one on the far right in this picture, and his brother Charles Keck is the guy in the smock, the artist's smock. Both of these men came from a family of amazing, prolific and prominent artists. They were all German immigrants, and they had a third brother who is renowned for arts and crafts, stained glass, and he was working out of Syracuse. So they were all three male members of this family were very prominent in the art world. One of the other things that Maxfield Keck designed were these medallions that you can see on the wall of Newark Penn Station, not New York, but Newark Penn Station, which went up in 1935. And there's, I think, 13 medallions around the walls, and each one is a different transportation theme, starting with canoes. This is one of them. This is the Mayflower. So each one of them looks like this, but with a different thematic design related to transportation. He also did ocean-related rondelles for a building on Coney Island, a restaurant called Child's Restaurant. It was recently renovated. This is before the building was renovated, but he did these great rondelles for that. And then probably one of his more famous works is the Cincinnati train terminal, which has a main entrance flanked by these two bas-reliefs called representing commerce and transportation. So Maxfield Keck did them, and this is the transportation one that you see here. One of the other features in every Essex County park is a flag, and one of the stated goals that the park had, or the park system had, was to instill patriotism in people using the park. It sounds a little hokey, but they really wanted people to, they envisioned, especially at a time when you had a lot of immigrants who had moved to the area and they would have been using the parks. They envisioned them playing on the playing fields or just, in the parks and seeing the flag and that having an effect on them. So it's requirement that every county park have a flag, and actually the specific size of the flag is mandated, or it was early in the day, as it was a very large size, much larger than actually flies there now. And just this early days, the park had its flag in the north end of the park. Now it's in the south end. Then the other thing that the park, Anderson Park did was trigger a whole movement for the town to create its own town-wide park system. And this map shows you in these yellow areas, 4 different yellow areas, 1 in each ward, proposed parks that were proposed 1 year after Anderson Park opened. So when Anderson Park opened, the only other park that existed in the town was tiny little Crane Park, which is less than an acre large, and it's down, I think people now refer to it as the Lackawanna Plaza or something. It's a little tiny park by Lackawanna Plaza. That was really about it. Their Rand Park would come along soon, but not yet. And so as Anderson Park was being constructed in 1904, a town committee formed to consider buying parkland for this town-wide system, and Charles Anderson was a member of that committee, and he's credited with inaugurating the movement to establish a town-wide park system. So in April of 1906, there was a very controversial town referendum on acquiring these 4 tracts of land that you see on this map, totaling 72 acres. They would ultimately become what we now know as Nishawane Park, Edgemont Park, Glenfield Park, and Essex Park and Essex Field, or AKA Woodman Field. So this effort to create parks was framed, the pros and cons, and I say it was controversial. There were very vehement supporters and detractors to this effort. The supporters were framing this as a public health issue. Doctors and clergymen, as I mentioned earlier, were talking about, the poor woman who needed to air her sick baby, give it fresh air, and just remember, while we're worrying about a pandemic, there was tuberculosis at this point was a major health issue, and that was very much on people's minds. And it was understood that crowded, filthy conditions could, hasten tuberculosis. So there was definitely a push to have broad, open space, fresh air. The term often used was breathing spaces. Beauty spots and breathing spaces was the kind of terminology that was used. Jacob Riis, who you may know as the reformer who wrote about the squalor of New York City tenements, and he wrote the book How the Other Half Lives in 1890, he actually came to Montclair to speak on behalf of passing the vote for the town-wide park system. This is a photo Jacob Riis took of children in a New York City makeshift playground. And just the point here being that, you know, there was a real effort in towns where, like Montclair, I think only had one playground at the time, which was maybe attached to a school. There was just very little of that sort of thing. And so this townwide park system would make more of that happen. As I mentioned, it was very controversial. This issue like covered the front page of the Montclair Times for at least 2 weeks. As I said, the supporters were very concerned about density, public health. They also just thought, you know, that it was an issue of equality, that was terminology used even then for that issue. So you wonder, why would anybody be opposed to parks? Well, the reasons were several. The opponents didn't want the debt that would come with the required bond issue to buy these 72 acres. There were African Americans who largely were property renters, and they were worried that their rent would go up because their landlord's taxes would go up. And also widows and other women were worried about their taxes being raised, and they were worried about taxation without representation, because remember, women didn't have the right to vote yet at that time. So that was another issue. And you know, you had people, widows, writing letters to the editor about how they opposed taxation without representation and didn't want this property to be acquired. So that was a very real issue, but we know how it ended up. We have the parks, the vote passed, and we now have these beautiful parks, Edgemont Park here, of course, and later on, the township would acquire other parks, Mountainside Park, and other Essex County parks would be within the borders of Montclair, like Brookdale Park and Mills Reservation. And some of the original properties that started out as town parks, such as Glenfield, which I think was for a while called Maple, but I'm not sure about that. But they ultimately came into the Essex County Park system. So, you know, Glenfield started out as a town park and then became a county park. And now, so over a century after Anderson Park was created and the townwide park system was created, Montclair now enjoys 142 acres of city-owned public open space, and it borders on 700 acres of county parks and reservations, much of it Olmsted designed. Now, the creation of Anderson Park spurred development of the property immediately south of the park. And if you remember way back at the beginning of this slideshow, I showed you a 1906 atlas map where there was almost no construction to the south of the park except along North Mountain Avenue. But within 1 year of the park opening, this fellow here, Aaron W. Godfrey, bought up 18 acres south of the park, and with the plan of creating what he called a, quote, residential park, what you and I would call a subdivision. But he marketed it as being attached to Anderson Park, you know, and it having park-like features, and he had created roads and pathways that led directly into the park. So the subdivision's streets were aligned with entrances to the park, and there was very much a direct connection between the park and the neighborhood. This is the neighborhood which he called Oakcroft, and this is Edgemont Road looking from Godfrey Road looking north toward the park. So this Anderson Park, in the classification that John Charles Olmsted gave to various parks, falls under the category of what Olmsted called a neighborhood park, and it very much is a neighborhood park. And his other classifications for parks were reservations, such as what we know of as Mills and the other reservations, Eagle Rock and whatnot, and playgrounds. And also parkways. There was the Olmsteds designed a parkway system that never really reached the full scope that they envisioned, but that was also another classification. And just want to just show you in terms of how this is a neighborhood park, sort of how heavily it's used for everything: dog walking, biking, strolling, athletics, and so forth. So this photo, I think we'll see this kind of scene soon once the park reopens, but probably supposed to have a little more social distancing when that happens. I want to also just talk about how the park has changed over this century and 115 years. This map is shows the park in 1912, and you get a sense of the extent of the vegetation that was growing in the park. Very thickly planted with shrubbery, and a lot of that shrubbery has died out over the century, and so the park is sort of has its original bones, but not so much of its original flesh left still. It does have a lot of the oaks that Olmsted planted. He planted a lot of red oaks and pin oaks. Many of them were sited specifically at corners of triangles, landscape triangles. And a lot of these trees, though, are starting to reach the end of their lifespan, and they're dying out. And part of the mission of Friends of the Anderson Park is to replant, so that as these trees do reach the end of their lifespan and die out, there will be something in the wings to replace them. This is the athletic field or the meadow, whichever you want to think of it as. It's used for both sorts of things. A century ago, some of the things that were happening on this field are hard to imagine today, such as playing tennis. There were 6 tennis courts on this, grass tennis courts on this property. And also cricket was a big popular sport played on this field. So, that's not so much what it's used for today, much more soccer and lacrosse now, and touch football here in this picture. And a lot of dog walking. When the Olmstead set to work designing and building the park, they planted 17,500 trees and shrubs. And this is just one page of one of the planting list, which shows, specifically what species, how many of each species, how much they cost. This goes on for a number of pages, give you a sense of how well plotted out these plantings were. But as I mentioned, a lot of these are dying off. This one, on a bright sunny day, not even wind or anything, this tree just fell over at the south end of the park. It was completely rotten on the inside, but from the outside, you'd have no idea there was anything wrong with it. And this was one of my favorite trees that was taken down by the microburst maybe 10 years ago or so. So Friends of Anderson Park has been steadily replanting both trees and shrubs since we formed in 2006. Every Arbor Day, with the exception of this year when the park was closed on Arbor Day, we've planted trees with Girl Scouts. This is from last year. We've over our lifetime, we've planted more than 200 trees and shrubs. We also plant tulips that are provided to us by Man Montclair. So this is a tulip planting day, and this is the fruit of that labor. And this is just a beautiful spring day in the park, which I hope we're going to have some of this weekend. And so that's where I'll end.
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask Lisanne. We had somebody say that we had a couple of excellents, but we also had somebody say that Olmsted did nice work, but he read a biography, or she, I'm not sure who, and he was quoted as saying, "I like hiring the Irish because they work hard and I can get them for cheap." Have you heard that?
I haven't heard that. I wouldn't disbelieve it. But one thing I can tell you about Anderson Park, and I've seen the contracts for the construction of it, most of his labor were Italians. And maybe that was a function of who lived in this area. I mean, I'm sure there were Irish here, but maybe there were more Italians, or maybe there were more Italians in the construction field. But the contracts that I've seen that are in the amazing Essex County Parks Archives are mostly Italian names, or at least the people whose names are on the contracts. They may have hired people of all sorts of ethnicities and races, but the names that keep popping up are Italian.
Okay. Somebody else asked if you had any idea where he purchased his plantings.
I don't off the top of my head, but that probably isn't unknown, because when you look on the planting list, there are also receipts that are on file that say where they're, who things are purchased from. They wouldn't mean anything to me. I don't think there are places that still exist. But I think that is known, maybe not for every single plant, but it wouldn't be hard to track down some of that.
Just going back once to the Irish and the Italians, I think maybe along the lines of what different nationalities did in that era. I mean, a lot of stonemasons, came from Italy. St. Lucy's in Newark and the cathedral were built by people from essentially from Caserta, right? And your last presentation talked about, the stonework that was done by firms, and I think the opportunities to do stonework. And yet you would think, and I'm just not trying to stereotyping half Irish and half Italian, but the Irish may have been more inclined to do work that involved, greenery. I mean, that's just, kind of my take. I don't know. Regardless, Olmsted, it certainly is the comment that he wants to stick with his history in all of this. But I mean, that's just a possible explanation.
Anyone else have a question? You have another one wondering whether Charles Anderson got a big tax deduction.
I don't think he got a big tax deduction, but I think his property values went really up. I mean, he owned all of the property, or almost all of the property, immediately west of the park. The property that's now on the west side of North Mountain Avenue between Bellevue and Parkside. That almost all of that property was his. And when the park was built, that property was sparsely developed with a few vernacular wood frame houses. And you see what's on there now. So the property values, I'm sure, went up on those properties because they were enhanced by having a front window view of the park. And Charles Anderson himself built, I think, 2 houses on the park, one for one daughter and maybe one for a son. I'm a little fuzzy, and one was definitely for a daughter, the one that we saw with her children in the park in a photo. She lived in a big house on the park that Charles Anderson built, and he built another big house, and maybe he lived in the other big house, although his original house was on Upper Mountain, so I'm not sure. But his property values, I'm sure, went up right across from the park. So he came out well on this one.
And someone else, just on a different note, asked about the essay contest that's run by Friends of Anderson Park and said, could you comment on where that stands?
Oh, sure. It's not an essay contest. It's a short story contest for middle school students, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. We've done it for 2 years running. This is our 2nd year. The winners were announced, I believe, in late February, early March, and the 3 winners, their stories are running in the Montclair Times. The second one is in today's issue of the Montclair Times. The first one was 2 weeks ago. And the third one will probably be in 2 weeks from now. So it's been great. The stories are wonderful. They're imaginative. You have to, your story has to involve the park in some way. But other than that, there's very little limitation. And we've gotten some really great stories.
I have a question. I'm sorry I'm not using chat, Lisanne. How does the count and how do funds go to the park in terms of what's required on an annual basis and what's required as a long-term plan. If there's so much replanting and going back historically, how do those funds materialize within the Parks Department at the county level?
Well, most of the planting, pretty much all of the planting is now, like for the past 12 years or so, has been done by Friends of Anderson Park through fundraising. Donations that people just send us checks, or we have a raffle during the big art fair in the park. But the county generally nowadays, it's more in maintenance mode rather than in planting mode. They did in 2000 and I think it was 2005. There was $1 million grant that the county got from Green Acres, which is state money, and that money was used to re-engineer the field because it had bad drainage issues, and so they had to redo the drainage and redo the field, and they built the bathrooms that are there now, and they put in new benches, the benches that are there now, and other things like that. And then we applied for a Green Acres grant a few years ago to do some more plantings. And also to put in some irrigation. So that's state money, but I think it's matched by the county, as I recall. But most of what the county spends, year in and year out on the park is for maintenance, mowing, raking, that kind of thing, fixing broken pipes, so forth. But in terms of new plantings, that's done by Friends of Anderson Park fundraising.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
While I'm here on the fundraising, let me make a plug. I'm shameless. We have what we call a legacy tree program. So, people will donate money to plant a tree, in memory of someone who's died, or in celebration of, like a graduation or a wedding, or a significant birthday, that kind of thing. So, and we have people who will do that every year. Some people, that's just their thing. Every year they plant a tree in the park, and some people just do it for special occasions. And also just smaller donations, because it all adds up. And as I said, we've planted over 200 trees and shrubs. So the park is definitely getting greener and lusher. So it all helps.
Thank you, Lisanne, for making Anderson Park so beautiful today, and also for presenting it to us tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for your interest.